So before we get started, though, I do want to play a game. And as John leaves, I have a question for you. Did you bring it? That's a no. All right, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. I need a volunteer, first of all. Who wants to play a game? Trevor Wiseman? Come on up, bro. Come on up. Everyone give him a round of applause. We're very happy to have him here. Trevor, I was going to give you a blindfold, so I'm going to go off the honor system here. Will you just close your eyes? All right. Are your eyes closed? You can't see a thing?
Nope.
All right. Great. Y'all don't shush. Don't. Do you actually have a blindfold on you? Can I use it? Whoa, hot dog. All right. Hey, you know, if it covers, I can see through that.
Can't double it over.
Nah, dude, that's all right. I kind of got there. Anyway, I trust Trevor. He's not a cheater. All right, Trevor, do you believe that somewhere on this, I was going to say stage, somewhere on this floor, there is a chair for you to sit in?
Yes.
You believe somewhere in this room that there's a chair for you to sit in?
I believe.
You believe. Okay, he believes. That's good. That's good. Go ahead and just sit down in the chair for me.
Keep my eyes closed?
Yeah. Do you trust me that there's a chair behind you right now that you would sit in?
Yeah.
You just sat down right now that there's a chair behind you.
Is there actually a chair behind me? I don't know.
Okay.
Look at that. Okay.
All right, so he found the stool. All right, stand up for me.
Oh, okay.
Stand up for me.
All right.
I'm going to move this. There's another chair somewhere out here, or in front of you. If you step 3 steps in front of you and then spun around, do you think you'd be sitting in the chair? What if I told you that's exactly where you'd be sitting? Would you believe me then?
Maybe. Wait, what?
All right, that's good enough for me. You can sit down. You might be wondering why I decided to go through this weird charade. Honestly, I wish you had sat down with a little more confidence. I think it'd been funny if you just slapped it on the floor. But the reason I bring all this up is because today we're talking about a topic that I feel like a lot of people have heard about or maybe thought about, but don't really try to stay too on top of. And we're talking about blind faith. Blind faith, if you don't know, it's basically like the idea that Christians they claim to believe in God and they believe in him and they love him and they seek his truth, but they don't do it of their own accord, right? They do it based on something that their parents raised them in, based on something that their friends do, based on the smart pastor that they met as a kid, and he believes in God, so I'm going to believe in God too. Right? You live in ignorance, and you live off of other people's belief rather than believing in your own accord. In the same way, when Trevor was attempting to sit in the chair, he had to just solely believe on faith alone that there was a chair behind him. Right? And if he were to sit down without that confidence of knowing there's a chair, he could hurt himself. He almost did by slowly collapsing on the floor. If you were Trevor in that situation, there's a good shot you would not have just sat down blindly, right? You would have done exactly what he did. You may have felt behind you to see if there was a chair. You might have taken a couple steps to kind of feel your surroundings. You might have asked more questions of well, what if I move to my right, if I move to my left? You would not just on faith alone sit down and say, I'm going to sit, right? You would most likely ask me some questions. You'd feel around. You try to discover for your own self using reasoning and logic that there was a chair behind you before you were willing to sit down. In the same way, we should consider our faith the exact same way. I'm not saying that you can't believe in God without having some multi-long-year apologetics degree, but you should have some level of reasoning and logic as to why you follow the Christian God. If all you follow God for is because mom and dad told me to, or because my friend's smart and he believes in God, so I'm going to believe in God too, that's a very weak faith. And a lot of you might be thinking to yourself, I have logical faith, I've studied myself, I've done some research, or I've been taught a lot of things, and that's great. But how many times have we been sharing the gospel with someone and we freeze? We forget the answer to a question, or we've never heard that question before, we don't know how to answer something like that. There's so many opportunities that we miss, these amazing opportunities to spread the gospel, to share Jesus with somebody, but we miss it simply because we don't know the answer to a question. And once again, I'm not saying that we need to be some huge scientist that has every single answer on lock every time without fail, but if you can't answer even a basic question about why you believe God exists, if I walked up to you and said, why do you believe in God? And all you can tell me is, I don't know. He's cool. He loves me. That's a very weak understanding. If I'm an atheist, if I'm an agnostic, or even if I'm just new to faith, that's going to rock me. I'm not going to believe you for a second. And so when we look at blind faith, we look at it as a problem amongst a lot of Christians today, whether it be people who are new to faith and just haven't had a long time to study, or maybe it's someone who's been here for years, they've grown up in church, and they've just kind of ran through the motions, and they haven't really dove into why they believe with what they believe. I know a lot of people face doubt at some point in life, and maybe you're in this room and you're facing doubt right now. So hopefully, by the end of all this, whether you're a firm believer and you've done research for years, you're new to faith, you've been doubting something, or you don't know why you came here and you thought we just had free coffee, you're going to learn something today. So it's going to be a fun time. We want you to understand not just why we believe in God, but also how to explain it to someone, because that's an important aspect. If you brought your Bible, we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11 predominantly. We're going to flip around to a bunch of other verses and stuff, but if you brought your Bibles, Hebrews 11 is going to be where we're going to land for most of it. And we're going to refer to a lot of other stuff. I'm going to have a lot of stuff up on the screen, like notes and definitions and stuff. If you're the kind of person who has to write down everything that shows up on the screen, I may move too fast for you, and I'm so sorry because I'm definitely that person. So if you get too fast and you don't have time to write something down or take a photo, please come find me afterwards. I'd be more than happy to pass you all my info. I'm not trying to keep it a secret or anything of that nature. So if you run out of time or you can't finish a definition, please come find me afterwards. So first and foremost, the most important definition I think that we need to go through is blind faith, right? What is blind faith? Well, I like to go to Google for a lot of things. You consult the Oracle. And if you go to Google, the definition that it gives you for blind faith is this: belief without true understanding, perception, or discrimination. Pretty simple, right? It's the kind of faith that God desires us to have, though. Is that what we're called to do as Christians, to just kind of believe and not really think twice about it, just have full faith that that's what it is, no questions asked? Well, I think first we need to start with what the Bible says faith is in the first place. Before we can look at blind faith, let's just see what faith is in general. So there's a couple of popular verses that talk about faith. There's plenty of them. We're not have time to go through all of them, but there's a few that I want to land on at the beginning just to kind of set us some context of what we're going through. So the first one is 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. You don't have to flip there. It'll be up on the screen, but we're going to run through it together really quick, and we'll unpack it a little bit just so we can see what faith is, right? So verse 6 says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by the fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." If you're anything like me, the grammar in that is a little wonky, and if you go to a bunch of different translations, it's all the same way. So I had to read it a few times. Instead of rereading it a couple times until you all just get it, I'm just going to break it down for y'all, because I know for me it took me like 6 or 7 passages. It's a little too many. So Peter says 3 things about faith right here in this topic. First and foremost, he says that when trials come, the believer makes a choice to continue to trust God, right, in and through the trial. He says that God continues to provide, and our faith would grow stronger because of it. And then the second thing he does is he compares and he contrasts it to gold, right? Like gold, our faith is grown and refined through fire, right, through the trials of life. But what he says is that unlike earthly gold that would soon perish and eventually be worthless, our gold of eternity of faith will be given a gift in eternity. And then finally, the third thing he says is that our faith provides an opportunity to participate in giving and receiving praise, right? It gives glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed through our faith, right? So all that to say, for me, it didn't really narrow down a dictionary definition, something I can point to and say that's what faith is. So I thought back to my childhood, right? What were we told as kids? If you grew up in church, there's a good shot that you've probably heard of Hebrews 11:1. Which is why we're landing there. And it talks about how faith is believing in something you can't see, right? The actual verse specifically says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see," right? Belief in what we cannot see. Hebrews 11, by the way, if you've never heard of it or you're new to it and you've never read it before, it is an amazing chapter, just like all sorts of other chapters in the book. But Hebrews 11 specifically is like the Hall of Fame of faith, right? It is the book that literally goes back through tons of Old Testament stories, all these people, all these prophets, and it talks about and elaborates on them and why they were so good at what they did, right? It talks about Noah, talks about Jonah, talks about Abraham, talks about Adam, all sorts of these people that did good and great things, and it goes back and it walks through why they did what they did, or it gives more explanations as to what they're going through. So today, we're going to go through it. We're not going to read all 40 verses. We'd be here all night, but I encourage you to go back and read it through yourself. But what we're going to be landing on is it gives us an explanation of a man named Abraham and his son Isaac. And we're going to look at his story and figure out what exactly God wants us to do. Because Abraham is known to us as like an example of faith, right? He's proclaimed as one of the most faithful men in all of the Bible. So if we can copy his faith, then we're doing great. We're doing solid. So we're going to look at his story, and we're going to see what he did, how he reacted to situations, and then see how we can model our lives after him. So before we can get into the Hebrew side, we got to figure out what his story was in the first place. So I'm going to flash back to Genesis. You don't have to flip there if you don't want to. It'll be up on the screen. But we're just going to read through his story really quick just for some context so we can understand what he's going through, what God promised him. And then we can unpack why he did and why he learned about it. So Genesis chapter 12 says this: "The Lord has said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you.'" Then we flash forward to chapter 22. He says, God says, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you." And when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar. He arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, here I am." He replied, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. And now that I know you fear God, you will not have withheld from me your son, your only son." So we see here that Abraham is told by God that his son would be the one that would carry on this legacy, right? He was told he'd be a father of many nations, and that his wife Sarah would bear him the child, even though they were very old. If you didn't know, it's actually a fun fact. Sarah and Abraham were very, very old when this took place. Sarah would have been like about 90, and Abraham would have been about 100. So already just the birth of Isaac in general is like a miracle in and of itself, which gives some precedence. That shows that Abraham already has some faith in God, that he knew that would happen, and God did deliver in that moment. But then God tells Abraham to do something really, really crazy. He says, that son, that one that I gave you that miracle of birth from, the one that I said would give birth to many, many nations, the one that would populate the world and bring your name through and carry on my legacy, I want you to kill him. I want you to sacrifice him for me, because that's when I'll know you're truly faithful to me. That's a tough thing to swallow, man. That's pretty crazy. Abraham does it, though. He doesn't kill the boy, but he makes every attempt to do so. He goes up, he prepares the altar, he gets the sacrifice ready, which would be his son, and he gets ready, and he's about to stab him down, and the angel says, "Stop. Now that I know you're willing to do it, don't do it." And we actually see later on that a ram got caught in the thicket, and then they come by, and they sacrifice the ram, and they still make their sacrifice, and everything works out. But we look at this story, and it seems a little counterproductive to my original point. Because my first reading, it seems like Abraham followed God kind of blindly, right? He didn't ask questions. He didn't really think about it. It didn't say that he sat down for a couple hours and really pondered the logical thought of whether or not he should or he shouldn't. He didn't weigh the pros and the cons. He just did it. He said, "Sacrifice my son, bet," and just went for it. He didn't even think about it. This kind of shows that Abraham had blind faith here, right? He just kind of blindly went with what God said. He didn't ask questions. He didn't think about it. Just kind of followed through and went to go try to kill his son. It kind of makes it seem like God was rewarding him for it too, because it says like, now I know you're faithful. I'm going to go through your many nations. And it also talks about he's like the role model, right? He's supposed to be the guy we model our faith after. So it's a little bit of confusing. Luckily, there's a New Testament. And if we go flash forward to Hebrews, where we're going to land today, in chapter 11, verse 17, we can unfold a little bit more of Abraham's story. We can kind of see what Abraham was thinking about and what he was going through during this moment. And we can see how he came to the conclusions that he did. So verse 17 says this: "By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.'" Basically, through Isaac, your legacy will continue. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Y'all read that last verse, verse 19? Abraham reasoned that God had promised a great nation through Isaac, that even if Isaac were killed, that God could bring him back from the dead and continue on. This doesn't seem that crazy to us. We've seen plenty of stories where God brought people back from the dead, Jesus being one of them. But at this time when Abraham was alive, that was unprecedented. God had not brought somebody back from the dead. The closest thing he had done is he had brought somebody up in a chariot of fire to go to heaven. So at this moment, no one had ever been brought back from the dead. But Abraham knew who God was. He knew God's character, he knew God's promises, and he knew that God would not go back on his word. And because of that, he knew that that promise that Isaac made, it would be fulfilled somehow, some way. That God would have the power to do anything and everything that he needed to fulfill his promises, even if it meant bringing somebody back from the dead, which had never been conquered precedently. Right, that's powerful. Didn't set any boundaries on God's power. He went through it. And it says he reasoned all of that and went through. So we look at Abraham, right? We see that it's not blind faith, right? He reasoned, he thought about it, he had logic behind it, and he ended up making his action according to that. And it's not just Abraham. Abraham's not the only one who ever just sat down with some logic and reasoning and then acted accordingly through faith, right? Throughout Scripture, we find reason, wisdom, and logic, they're all lifted up as good traits. For example, Proverbs 3:13 says, we're blessed when we find knowledge and understanding. Hebrews 5:12 through 14 reproves teachers for not just learning and growing and understanding, but like really diving in deep, right? Acts 17:11, Paul commends the church of Berea because they searched the scriptures daily to see if what Paul was saying was true. They went back and checked the Old Testament. They checked the scriptures to go, yeah, he's right. What he teaches and what he says is true is actually true. They went back and looked through it. James 1:5 tells us to ask God for wisdom, right? It says that he gives it generously to all of us without finding fault, right? There's many other places, reason and logic and understanding, they're all uplifted. But to state the point simply, God created humans with the ability to think and to reason. And God expects us to use that gift, right? Remember that its core, the goal of logic and reason is to find truth. And Jesus made the bold claim that he is the truth. So logically speaking, funny enough, if we use reason and logic to apply ourselves when it comes to faith, it should lead us to Jesus every time, right? Or something's not adding up. The Bible must be false and we're all wasting our time, right? So if we look in with logic and faith, then we should point us to Jesus every single time, right? We're expected to act in faith on God's promises, just as Abraham did, but we're supposed to do it from a position of trust based on the knowledge that we have of God, right? He followed God's order based on what he had known God to do, based on his character and his promises, and we're to do the same. There's actually a guy, his name is St. Augustine. If you've ever looked at history before, or you've looked at Christian history specifically, you've probably heard of this guy. He's decently famous within that realm. If you're like me, I don't look a whole lot at Christian history unless it piques my interest, like in this segment. But St. Augustine, he's a smart dude, right? I'm just going to be pointing out, he's a smart dude. He was the Bishop of Hippo, which is like modern-day Anna of Algeria. I don't know where that is. I didn't look it up, but I'm sure some geography major in here probably can point it out to me. And he lived during the 5th century, right? He's a renowned theologian. He was like a prolific writer. He was a rhetorician, which basically just means he restored the Bible, right? He spoke the Bible to people who didn't have the translation for it. And he was also a skilled preacher, right? He had this philosophy, and he has this amazing quote that I found, and it refers to blind faith, right? This idea that we're talking about today. This is his quote. Myself is understanding. Believe in order to understand, and understand in order to believe. Not blind faith, but a description of the actual interaction of experience and reason, right? Authentic understanding is a function of both faith and reason. Look, if y'all don't have time to take a picture or something, like, we're going to leave it up there because that's some fire. St. Augustine is spitting some heat right here. What he's saying, basically, right, the only way to truly understand something is to think about it and have faith in it at the exact same time, right? He's not saying you need to go into some full multi-long year study of apologetics in order to be a true Christian or to have true faith. But what he's saying is that you need to put deductive reasoning skills into your faith. You need to put some logic behind it. To determine the truth of the world around us, that's what we're called to do. And so with all this, we know that reason, logic, all these things, these are uplifted as good traits. So I feel like it's only appropriate to try to teach you guys a little bit of what some arguments are for Christianity, right? Some of you guys, if you've studied this before, you've gone through this on your own, you've probably heard these before. These are some of the more like popular arguments for why Christianity is truth, right? If you're giving the gospel to someone who's never heard of Christ before, or is a prolific atheist. Maybe they're agnostic, they don't care enough about church. These are the kind of things that you can use and you can explain to them to try to help your case, right? Because if you walk away with this only going, man, I should really apply some logic, and then you have nothing to show, I feel like that's a little silly. So we're not going to go super deep into any one of these arguments or anything, because we could do whole lectures and sermon series on all of these, but I just want to touch on them at least a little bit so you can write them down. You can always go back home later and read through them. So the first one is called the teleological argument. Really fancy word. Basically just means the fine-tuning of the universe. Maybe a lot of you guys have probably heard of this before, that the idea that the universe is fine-tuned to such a specific degree that the way that the universe is set up, that it is the precise conditions in order to allow sentient life to happen, right? I'm sure you guys have heard plenty of different facts and figures of, if the earth was 2% closer to the sun, we'd all burn up. If we were 1% further away, we'd all freeze to death. If the moon wasn't precisely in orbit, we wouldn't have a day and night. If the earth wasn't rotated at such an axis, we wouldn't have seasons to grow crops. Like all sorts of things like these. This is what it's talking about with fine-tuning, that all these things came together in such a precise and meaningful way that it allowed not just some life to form, but sentient life could form, grow, and know and reflect upon its own self, right? All those things, it's just too coincidental to be, or it's too purposeful to be a coincidence, right? We can think about it like a house, right? You have doors, windows, roof, chimneys, whatever else your house might have, right? All these things are there to build and allow life to thrive and grow, right? It would be silly to assume that if I had a bunch of concrete and mold and drywall and all sorts of other things, that they would come together and I could just set off an explosion and that it would all form together into a perfectly made and ready to go house. The ability for that to happen, I don't know the numbers, I'm no mathematician, but I imagine it's 0.00 plenty of them to 1%. It would never happen, right? It wouldn't happen. In the same way, it would be silly for us to think of our universe in the same way, that you could just have this big bang, this explosion, and that everything would just line up perfectly for us to thrive and grow. What has a creation needs a creator, right? And with that, gives us our second argument, the cosmological argument. Now, they're a little bit of a fancier word. We're kind of dialing in on what normal words look like. But this one is a little bit more simple and straightforward. It's the idea that something couldn't have come from nothing, right? The beginning of the universe, it had to have had some start to it. In order to have a world that is time-bound, space-bound, and material, you need something outside of those things to put it into motion, right? So that you need a timeless, spaceless, and immaterial being to put all that into motion. That sounds a lot like God to me. And so the cosmological argument says exactly that. You need something outside of those realms and those restrictions in order to create those restrictions. There's also the moral argument. I'm going to be honest when I say this one's not really my personal favorite, but it is still a good argument to hold, and there is a lot of truth in it. So I still wanted to bring it up. It's a very popular one as well. It basically says that we all have this moral code that's naturally written onto our hearts, right? We all know it's wrong to steal and to murder. We know that these things are objectively wrong. But in order to have objective morality, you have to have something to base that objective morality on. Because there's no way for me to determine if my morality is better or worse than yours unless we have something to compare it to, right? I might personally believe that killing's not that big a deal. I find it enjoyable, and if I get pleasure out of it, then what's the problem, right? You would probably disagree. And the only way we can have objective morality with that is to have something to base it on, right? C.S. Lewis actually talks about, he talks about a lot of stuff, but he talks about this specifically, and there's the standard morality for someone. To be able to say my morality is better than yours is silly, right? If we all know that right and wrong, why do people disagree on morality? Well, the idea is that there must be a God or some higher authority to determine that right from wrong. The last argument we're going to hit on, probably the one you guys have heard about a lot more, or at least I hope so, is the historical argument. Probably the most important one. It's my personal favorite because I think it's what holds the most weight and water in the world. Because it doesn't just lead to the idea of a God or the idea of a deity, but the historical argument talks about why Christianity specifically is the way. And a historical argument is basically just, simply put, a lot of the amount of solid evidence that the Bible's accurate descriptions of events happened, right? All these discoveries, and all these documentations of the area that they all line up with what the Bible says is true. And once again, we're not going to dive super deep into the historical argument, but I did want to at least notice 3 things within it that you guys can kind of just mentally be aware of, right? There's 3 things, historically speaking, that is pretty much undisputed amongst scholars, Christian or otherwise, that they all line up with what history says is true. The first one, Jesus' baptism. First of all, if you didn't know, Jesus was a real man. We have plenty of historical evidence, as I'm about to show, but no scholar would ever disagree that Jesus of Nazareth was not a real man. Now, you can make arguments of whether he created miracles, whether he, was the true Son of God. You can make arguments for all sorts of stuff, but to deny that he existed and that he walked the earth is just silly. A lot of people seem to be under this impression that he's just like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. It's just something that people make up to make themselves feel good, and that's not the case. There's a lot of evidence like we're about to go over. Right, his first one is his baptism, right? There's a man named John the Baptist, and those of you who have heard about him before probably know that he's Jesus' cousin. He was like the last prophet, the first and only one in the New Testament that like paved the way for Jesus to start his ministry. And he lived during the first century, just when Jesus did, obviously. And we have so many documentations that show that not only was Jesus real, but that John the Baptist was real. And we can kind of cross-examine those to go, okay, well, if we can prove he's real, and we can prove he's real, and they also, go with each other, then that kind of puts a cohesive narrative together. We know that he was executed by Herod Antipas, which was attested to in first century historians. There's a guy named Josephus. If you guys look into like history and you look into like apologetics and things like that, you're going to see his name pop up a lot. He's a very prolific writer of the first century. And we're not going to go through all his accounts or anything. We'd be here all night. But what you should know about Josephus is he wrote an insane amount of stuff. He wrote basically anything and everything that he saw that day in his books. And to the best of our knowledge, he was not a Christian. He's just a dude, which means, sad that, he didn't find Christ. But in a roundabout way, good for us, because we know for a fact that he wouldn't have lied. He had no reason to lie. He would have just written down whatever he saw that day. And we know for a fact that he talks about plenty of different things. He talks about Jesus getting baptized. He talks about the crucifixion of Jesus. He talks about how the Romans would put him up on the cross and that the Jews would be the one to get him down, so to speak. And he also talks about Jesus' disciples. We know that these 12 people that went and followed Jesus around, that they were real people. We have plenty of accounts of not just from Josephus, but from other people. Tacitus is another famous one, and a bunch of other people that talk about these guys going around and proclaiming the gospel. So we know that Jesus of Nazareth was a real man. And we know that he walked this earth. We know that he proclaimed he was the Son of God. There's a common thing, I think it's C.S. Lewis, I could be wrong. He talks about that Jesus is one of 3 L's, right? He's a liar, meaning he just knew he was making stuff up and he was just a really good con artist. He's a lunatic. He genuinely believed what he was the Son of God and he wasn't, or he's Lord. He said he was the Son of God and he most certainly was. And one of the best historical arguments for why Jesus wasn't just a man, that he didn't just exist, but he truly was the Son of God, are his disciples. We have so many accounts from these disciples that say that Jesus not only performed miracles, that he raised from the dead and that he came back and that he did it so that he could save us from our own sins and the things that we needed to do. There was plenty of disciples that were pulled aside. They were arrested, they were beaten, they were killed, they were tortured. They were done all these sorts of things. And we have different accounts of all of them doing different things, right? Some of them may have, worshiped Caesar. Some of them may have broken and said, I love Caesar and I'm so sorry for my actions. Some of them may have legitimately died for their sins. Yes, but some of them would have died for their faith. And a lot of them would have been beaten and tortured and wrung out for all sorts of different answers. But at the end of the day, not a single one on record ever said anything about Jesus being a liar or that they made it up or that nothing really came out. He didn't really come back from the dead. We just made it all up, right? None of them said a word about any of that. Why? Because it was true, right? If you're willing to get tortured, beaten, and killed for your faith, and you're willing to go to the grave every single time, if you're a liar, they must have had some of the most strongest willpowers in the history of mankind, because no one in their right mind would be willing to take that to the grave. One person is already a tough thing to crack, but you could have some crazy people out there. But to have not just 12, but to have hundreds of people that would come after them also face the same trials, I think that's a bold claim to say that there wasn't some truth behind what they were saying. And there's many more arguments and reasons that we could go into, We could have easily done a full sermon on any of these, like I was talking about, but the main thing that we should take away from this is that we can have assurance that not only God exists, he does exist, and we can prove he does with both logic, reasoning, and understanding. Just what you're talking about. There's no need to have blind faith because there's so much evidence that supports not just God, but Christianity in general. Now we take this information, we apply it to ourselves, but we can also apply it to other people. And we can use this as a time to have these conversations with people, to evangelize, right? We can use this to take to other people. And we can use this as an opportunity to not just know for our own sake, but to explain to others, right? A lot of times I feel like when we share the gospel, we're intimidated, we're nervous, we're scared, we're confused, we're all sorts of things, right? And that's not to say that we'll never feel those things again, or even if we sit here and study for years and years and years, that we'll never feel that way again. But the more we study on these things, these arguments, these logical reasonings, these things like that, the more you meditate on that, the more confident you feel in what you share, right? And if you're having a conversation with someone, there's no shame in having to go research something. There's no shame in saying, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm going to look into it and get back to you. But it gives us that confidence to be able to go and share the gospel with people. And at the end of the day, that's what we as Christians are called to do. The most important thing we're called to do is the Great Commission, is to go and make disciples, right? Evangelize. Tell people about Christ. If we don't know anything about Christ ourselves, we can't share that news. We can't share the good news with someone effectively if we don't understand why we believe it ourselves. And so that's why I talk about this. That's why I talk about this blind faith, because it's such a poison on Christians as a whole. Now, there will be times in our walk with God that we act purely on faith because we don't have the whole picture, like Abraham did. Abraham never saw his Isaac blossom into a great nation. He died before that moment happened, but he held faith anyways, right? His faith wasn't blind even in those situations. It's based on the knowledge of God's character and his nature, the promises in his scriptures, and our personal experience with walking in every day.